to yet another episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World. I'm Dr. Jeff Guernsey, joined by Dr. Jeff Heyman. We've talked about markets in the past, but Dr. Heyman, let's talk about this thing called competitive markets.
Sure.
Talk that through, and what are some characteristics of those markets?
In the chapter that we have in the textbook on market structure overall, we make a distinction between multiple types of market structure, and the first one being what we call a perfectly competitive market, or alternatively a price taker market. And these markets are have a lot of features in them, and you would recognize some of them, that nobody's able to influence the price of the good. You've got to just take the goods price as it is. If you're a producer, you get to sell as many as you want. Likewise, if you're a consumer, you can buy as many as you want at that given market price without affecting the overall price. In these competitive markets, they are going to have a good that's going to be all identical. Every producer is going to make the same type of product. Each individual producer and each consumer is also a very small part of the overall market, and that's why they have no ability to influence the price. They can buy or sell as much as they want without affecting the price. And so as part of that as well, to get that one price, the last kind of big assumption we would throw in there is there's this idea of almost perfect information, that the buyer and sellers are aware of everything that's going on in the market, such that if somebody's charging a penny more somewhere else, they're going to go find the penny less kind of market. There's no way for someone to have a differential price or advantage. And there's really, in a very interesting way, you could almost say that a competitive market is not competing at all, because there's nothing that they can do to distinguish their product. For those of us that are trying to decide on I don't know whether you're ever going to get a different car. What do you look for? You look for whatever feature you want, and you're looking for some sort of difference to make that particular one a little bit above the cut. Or if you want a new clothes, does it fit better? Does it look better? All these kinds of things. Those are not the kinds of dimensions that you can have in a competitive market, because the outcome, everything's identical. We will be back into the world of Henry Ford, and you can have any car you want as long as it's black. That's the way it's going to be. So that's at least a starting point to think about
So
this.
some of the examples you just referred to, I mean, those products are slightly differentiated, right?
Sure.
Cars are not all identical.
Yeah.
But many times people will use agricultural markets as an example of something that's really close to perfectly competitive.
Yeah.
Farmer Joe's corn, it's not that much different.
Farmer Joe, we should bring Farmer Joe up.
Okay. Well, I didn't know that. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. He has meat. He has wheat. Not corn. But go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, this is a way to think about it, because you're right. The markets that we know that this is relatively unrealistic. But there's some markets that start to approximate what a perfectly competitive or price taker market would be. So commodities in general would be the kinds of markets that would fit this bill. I mean, for the most part, the metal silver is still silver. Gold is still gold. Copper is still copper. Wheat is still wheat, or is it? I mean, we're finding a lot with agricultural goods, for instance, this wouldn't hold. I mean, we're seeing a lot of organic products and things like
GMO,
that. But let's just assume that the wheat market, which it is a global market, and we could imagine, even though I've got the label here, some sort of overall equilibrium price that we would have. And we would have the idea of a wheat market leading to some sort of equilibrium. And notice what I've got here is 650 million tons. And since I am certainly not a farmer, I have no idea how many millions of tons or billions of bushels are out there in the actual global wheat market. But for our example, we would say that some farmer would be contributing 5 tons out of 650 million. And in that case, he would be literally the drop in the bucket. And so for the individual farmer, he would see a constant price. And so for that, his only decision is whether to produce at that, and he's going to produce according to his cost structure, where his cost structure actually intersects with the marginal revenue. Last time in one of our earlier videos, we talked about how the profit maximizing condition must be where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So Farmer Joe is going to produce right here where his marginal cost equals his marginal revenue. And that's kind of a benefit of this model is saying he's just going to produce there and it's efficient and everybody's happy. So that's kind of one aspect of this for a very limited subset of goods that you might say kind of look like this. One other thing you were saying earlier I should bring up about this. In the wheat market, we talked about, in any sort of competitive market, and we outlined this in a previous video, but we should remember now because we're going to contrast this with a subsequent video on monopoly. At this particular equilibrium outcome, we're going to have a large consumer surplus, which is the area above the equilibrium price but below the demand curve, where the consumers benefit. They value all of these goods at a higher price than the cost of production as represented in the supply curve. And so all of those goods produced in an equilibrium price, you're going to see every single one produced where the value is greater than the cost of production. And you're going to see no goods produced to the right of this Q star where the cost of production is greater than the value to consumers. And so we say this is a very allocatively efficient result. We talked about it earlier, but competitive markets lead to that. That's another aspect when we think about competition and why it's good. Even if it's an unrealistic kind of perspective, we know that competitive outcome is something that's desirable. So that's another thing.
So you've alluded to what's the good or the benefit of a competitive market. You've suggested that markets in reality are not perfectly competitive. You talked about these different characteristics. Where do many markets not meet those characteristics? Is it many players, the price taker, the perfect information, the identical product? What is it?
I think the key number one error in this model is the idea of perfect information. There's virtually always arbitrage opportunities because of people not being aware. I certainly know I don't have perfect information when I'm out shopping. I don't think you probably do either. Mm-hmm. We're always trying to find the best kind of price we can get in the different providers. That's why we shop around. We do our Google search and other things. That's helpful, but there's always ways to think about it differently. And the second thing, of course, would be especially the standard identical product. For the most of the things we consume in this world, we are always trying to find a way to make it a little bit better. And in fact, I would argue that that's the very nature of the competitive process is how does one entrepreneur try to distinguish their product from others to make it a little bit more differentiated and something that you and I'd want to buy. Often I would talk in my class because I date myself, but you will probably resonate with this because you're about my age. So when I was a kid, we had two kinds of apples in the store. We had those green ones. And those green ones were very crisp and firm, but they were very sour. And we had those red ones, the ones that had a very hard, waxy skin and were mushy in the middle, but were at least sweet. And that's all we had, except for a certain limited time of the year where we would get these yellow ones that would come, the Golden Delicious. They would come, and they were kind of crisp and sort of sweet. And for a little bit of time of the year, you'd have a decent apple. Although you could bake with those green ones. Now, you go to the grocery store, and what do you have? Myriads of myriads, and they're very good. Honeycrisp and Pink Lady and all these things that I love. And they're so good. I was so happy when Braeburns came out a decade or so ago, and they're now like poor compared to what we have with these other apples. And the point is, they're entrepreneurs that are doing research on genetics on how they can make even what we would think is an agricultural market and make these things better. Initially, organic vegetables and fruits almost were just kind of a total tagline. And they always would spoil faster and so forth. But now people have been competing. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, the ones that I eat at least, I find the organic strawberries are better. They're better tasting. So there's competition even on things that you might be thinking might be identical. They're really not identical. And so even on some of the commodity spaces, for instance, we still see that. If you go on the oil market, for instance, oil's oil, right? No, there's Texas Intermediate, there's the light sweet crude, and all those different kinds of, depending on where it comes out of the ground and so forth. So all those are kind of variations along that theme. But this is at least a good starting point for us to think about what a market could look like if we had these kind of characteristics, and it will be contrasted when we get to the monopoly market in a subsequent video.
Very good, and we will probably do that shortly. Well, at the end of this video, go find a nice crisp apple to enjoy and thank competition for that. That's the end of this episode of No Free Lunch, Economics for a Fallen World.